Elena Martinez wasn't the kind of lawyer people noticed when she walked into a courtroom. She didn't wear flashy suits or carry a booming voice that filled the room. Most days she showed up in a simple blouse and slacks, her dark hair pulled back, a worn leather briefcase in hand, and eyes that stayed focused on her notes more than the crowd. She didn't seek attention. She didn't need it. What she did need, and what she gave everything she had, was fairness for the people no one else wanted to fight for. She worked as a public defender in a city that liked to pretend it was fair, but everyone who'd been around long enough knew better. The courthouses here had marble floors and tall windows, but behind the polished wood and gavels, deals were made in whispers. Some judges moved cases along based on who was paying attention, not what the law said. And Judge Roland Pierce? He wasn't just part of that system, he practically ran it. Pierce had been on the bench for over 15 years. He wore custom-tailored robes, drove a car that cost more than most people's houses, and always seemed to know which developers, politicians, or business owners needed a case dismissed for the good of the community. He smiled for cameras, gave speeches about law and order, and never missed a chance to remind younger lawyers, especially the ones from the public defender's office, that they were lucky just to be in his courtroom. Elena had seen him in action before. She'd watched him cut off defense attorneys mid-sentence, roll his eyes at motions that were clearly valid, and sometimes even laugh when someone tried to argue a point he didn't like. But she'd never been the target, until now. Her new client was a young man barely out of his teens, accused of robbing a convenience store at gunpoint. The police report was thin. No weapon recovered, no fingerprints, just one shaky eyewitness who said the suspect looked like him. Security footage from the store was grainy, taken from an old camera, angled too high to show clear facial features. But the arrest had happened fast. The charges filed within hours, and the media had already painted him as dangerous. Elena read the file twice before even meeting him. Something didn't add up. The timeline was off. The store clerk said the robbery happened at 9:15 p.m., but city bus records, pulled quietly by Elena's investigator, showed her client swiping his transit card 2 miles away at 9:08. He'd been on a bus heading home from his night shift at a laundromat. No alibi witnesses, no fancy lawyer to call attention to it, just a kid who didn't know how to fight back. When she met him in the county jail, he barely looked up. His hands trembled as he spoke. "They don't believe me," he said softly. "They say I'm lying, but I swear I wasn't even there." Elena nodded. "I believe you," she said simply, and she meant it, not because she was naive, but because she'd seen too many cases where the truth got buried under assumptions. Rushed investigations and pressure to close files fast. Back in her tiny office, stacked with case files, coffee mugs, and a wilting plant she kept forgetting to water, she started digging. She requested the full police report, the original 911 call, and any body cam footage. She filed a motion to suppress the eyewitness ID, arguing it was tainted by suggestive police procedures. She even found a retired detective who agreed to review the case pro bono. Everything pointed to a weak, possibly wrongful arrest. But then came the assignment. Judge Pierce would be presiding. Her stomach dropped. She knew what that meant. Pierce didn't like public defenders slowing down his docket. He especially didn't like them challenging police work or questioning eyewitnesses. In his courtroom, reasonable doubt was often treated like a nuisance. Still, she prepared. She rehearsed her arguments. She printed extra copies of case law. She reminded herself that the law was on her side, even if the judge wasn't. The morning of the pre-trial hearing, she arrived early. The courthouse buzzed with clerks, bailiffs, and attorneys rushing between rooms. She sat quietly in the back row, reviewing her notes, sipping black coffee from a paper cup. Across the aisle, the prosecutor, a sharp-dressed man who'd never lost a case in Pierce's courtroom, glanced at her and smirked. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. When Judge Pierce entered, the room stood. He swept in like he owned the place, robe flowing, chin high. He gave a quick nod, sat down, and called the case without looking up. "State versus the defendant," he said, flipping through papers. "Motion to suppress the identification. Counsel for the defense, Ms. Martinez, is it?" "Yes, Your Honor," Elena said, rising calmly. She laid out her argument clearly. The witness had been shown a photo array that included her client's picture twice by accident. The lighting during the lineup was poor, and the officer conducting it had hinted at the right answer. She cited 2 recent state Supreme Court rulings that required such IDs to be thrown out if procedures weren't followed. Pierce listened with a bored expression. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed like she'd wasted his time. "Ms. Martinez," he said, voice dripping with condescension. "Are you seriously asking this court to toss out the only solid lead in an armed robbery because of a procedural hiccup? This isn't law school. Out here we deal with real criminals." A few lawyers in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. The prosecutor smirked again. Elena didn't flinch. "With respect, Your Honor, the law protects everyone, even those accused, from unreliable evidence. That's not idealism. That's the Constitution." Pierce's eyes narrowed. He denied her motion without even calling the detective to testify. Denied. Next. As she sat down, her hands were steady, but her mind was racing. This wasn't just about one motion. This was about a judge who'd already decided the outcome. And worse, he'd made it personal. During a short recess, she stepped into the hallway to catch her breath. That's when he found her. "Ms. Martinez," Judge Pierce said, appearing beside her near the water cooler. He spoke low, just loud enough for her to hear. "You're new to my courtroom, so let me give you some advice. Don't make waves. This young man? He's guilty. Everyone knows it. Save yourself the trouble and your client the heartache and take the plea deal." Elna looked him in the eye. "I don't take advice from people who ignore the law, Your Honor." His smile vanished. For a split second, something cold flashed in his gaze. Then he straightened his robe and walked away without another word. But Elena didn't walk away. She went back to her office, opened a new folder on her computer, and titled it, "Judicial Misconduct, Judge Pierce." She'd heard rumors for years about favors, fast-tracked evictions for developers, mysteriously dismissed cases involving campaign donors. Now she had a reason to dig deeper. She wasn't loud. She wasn't flashy, but she was thorough, and she never forgot a detail. That night, long after the courthouse lights went out, Elena sat at her kitchen table, cross-referencing court dockets, property records, and campaign finance reports. She found odd patterns. Cases dropped right after large consulting fees appeared in certain bank accounts, rulings that always seemed to benefit the same handful of businesses, and a luxury condo purchased in cash under a relative's name. She didn't act out of anger. She acted out of duty. Because if no one held the powerful accountable, then what was the point of the law at all? And deep down, she knew this case wasn't just about proving her client's innocence. It was about proving that even the quietest voice could shake the walls if it spoke the truth. The morning of the trial arrived with heavy clouds hanging low over the city, as if the sky itself sensed something tense was about to unfold. Elena woke before dawn, not because she was nervous. She'd been in tough courtrooms before, but because her mind wouldn't stop working. She'd spent the last week quietly gathering more than just legal arguments. She'd been watching, listening, and connecting dots that others had ignored. She knew Judge Pierce wouldn't make this easy. After their hallway exchange, she'd expected retaliation, and she got it. The judge had moved the trial date up without proper notice, denied her request for additional time to interview a key witness, and even questioned her credentials in front of the clerk's office staff, calling her overzealous and out of her depth. But Elena didn't react. She never raised her voice. Instead, she documented everything, dates, quotes, even the way he'd leaned in too close during that hallway talk, his cologne sharp and his tone edged with warning. She also reached out carefully to a reporter she'd met years ago at a legal ethics conference. The woman now worked for an independent news outlet that specialized in government accountability. Over coffee at a quiet diner far from the courthouse, Elena shared just enough to spark interest without revealing her hand. "There's a pattern," she'd said, "not just in my case, in dozens." The reporter's eyes had lit up, but she promised discretion. "If there's a story here," she said, "we'll follow the paper trail, not the rumors." Now, standing outside the courthouse again, Elena adjusted her blazer and took a slow breath. Inside, the courtroom was already filling. Reporters weren't there yet. This wasn't the kind of case that usually drew attention, but a few curious law students and local attorneys lingered in the back, sensing something unusual was brewing. The defendant sat at the defense table, shoulders hunched, eyes darting toward the door every time it opened. He hadn't slept much either. "Do you think he'll listen today?" he whispered as Elena sat beside him. "I don't expect him to listen," she said gently, but I do expect him to follow the law. And if he doesn't, we'll make sure someone notices." The bailiff called the court to order. Judge Pierce entered with his usual air of importance, but today there was a tightness around his eyes, a slight stiffness in his step. He'd heard whispers, not about the case, but about the reporter asking questions downtown, about old rulings being re-examined, about a certain public defender who wasn't backing down. He opened the trial with a curt statement, barely glancing at the jury. Then the prosecutor stood, smooth and confident, painting a dramatic picture of a violent robbery, a frightened clerk, and a suspect who fit the description perfectly. He played the grainy store footage, pausing on a blurry figure in a hoodie. "That's him," he declared, pointing at the defendant. No doubt. Elena stayed quiet through the opening. She knew her turn would come, and when it did, she'd be ready. But Pierce wasn't waiting. During her opening statement, he interrupted her twice. Once for speaking too slowly, another time for making assumptions. The third time, he cut her off entirely. "Ms. Martinez, stick to the facts, not your theories," he snapped. "This isn't a philosophy class." A few jurors exchanged glances. One frowned. Elena simply nodded. "Of course, Your Honor," she said, her voice calm. She finished in 3 sentences and sat down. The prosecution called their first witness, the store clerk. On direct examination, he confidently identified the defendant as the robber. But Elena had studied his prior statements. They didn't match. Not even close. When it was her turn to cross-examine, she walked slowly to the center of the courtroom, hands empty, no notes, no folder. She wanted the jury to see her face, not paperwork. "Sir," she began, "you told police the robber was 6 feet tall, right?" "Yes. But you're 5'5". Would you say it's hard to judge someone's height when they're wearing a hood and holding a gun?" He hesitated. I guess. You also said he had a tattoo on his neck. Did you see that tattoo clearly?" "Well, under the store lights it was." "Actually," Elena said gently, The courtroom air felt thick, like the walls were holding their breath. Everyone could sense it. The tension wasn't just about the case anymore. It was about who would blink first. Judge Pierce sat high on the bench, fingers steepled, eyes narrowed as Elena stood calmly in the center of the room. She hadn't raised her voice once, but something in her quiet certainty made the prosecutor shift in his seat. She turned back to the store clerk, who was now sweating under the overhead lights. "You also told the detective the robber had a deep voice, right?" she asked. "Yes," he said quickly. "But in your first statement, written the night of the robbery, you said the man didn't speak at all, not a word. Is that correct?" The clerk swallowed hard. I might have been confused." Elena nodded, not unkindly. "It's a scary situation. Anyone would be shaken. But you didn't mention a tattoo, a height, or a voice that night. You only added those details 3 days later, after you saw a photo of my client in the police report. Isn't that true?" The clerk looked at the judge as if hoping for rescue. But Pierce stayed silent, jaw tight. He couldn't object. She was just asking questions. When the clerk finally mumbled, "I guess so," a ripple went through the jury box. One woman leaned forward, her expression shifting from neutral to concerned. Elena didn't press further. She simply said no more questions and walked back to her seat. The message was clear. The main witness wasn't reliable, and everyone knew it. Next came the lead detective, a tall man with a crisp uniform and a practiced courtroom swagger. On direct, he painted himself as thorough, professional, and certain. He swore the photo lineup was fair, the investigation clean, and the arrest solid. But Elena had spent nights studying every page of his report. She knew where the cracks were. "Detective," she began during cross, "you conducted the photo array alone, correct? No supervisor present?" "Yes. And you showed the witness 6 photos, but my client's picture appeared twice by accident. Is that right?" He hesitated. "It was a clerical error. A clerical error that made it twice as likely the witness would pick my client," she said. "Did you tell the witness it was a mistake?" "No. Did you note that error in your official report?" "No, but did you even mention it to the prosecutor before today?" Silence. The prosecutor finally stood. "Objection." Badgering the witness. Pierce didn't look at him. He stared at Elena, then sighed. "Overruled." "Answer the question." The detective's shoulders slumped. "No," he admitted. "I didn't." Elena let that hang in the air for a moment. Then she moved on, calm as ever. Now, about the security footage, why wasn't it reviewed before the arrest? It was reviewed, he said quickly. Then why does the timestamp show the suspect entering the store at 9:14 p.m.? But the bus transit system shows my client swiping his card 2 miles away at 9:08. And the bus takes at least 12 minutes to reach that area? The detective blinked. I wasn't aware of the bus records. You didn't check them? No. So you arrested a young man based on a shaky ID without verifying his alibi, even though public transit records are free and online? The detective didn't answer. He just looked down. Elena paused. Then, in a voice just loud enough for the jury to hear clearly, she said, Your Honor, I'd like to introduce Exhibit D, the time-stamped bus swipe record, verified by the City Transit Authority, showing my client was nowhere near the scene at the time of the crime. The prosecutor shot up. Objection. This wasn't disclosed in discovery. Elena turned slightly. Actually, it was. Page 17 of our supplemental filing submitted last Tuesday. The prosecution acknowledged receipt in an email the same day. She didn't say it smugly. She just stated it, like someone pointing out the sky is blue. Pierce's face darkened. He flipped through his own file, found the document, and scowled. He clearly hadn't read it. After a long pause, he muttered, Overruled. The exhibit is admitted. A quiet murmur spread through the room. Even the bailiff glanced up from his crossword puzzle, but Elena wasn't done. Your Honor, she said, I'd also like to call a rebuttal witness, Mr. Luis Rivera, the night security guard from the apartment complex where my client lives. Pierce frowned. Who? The guard who reviewed the building's lobby camera last week. He has footage showing my client entering his apartment at 9:22 p.m., 8 minutes after the robbery ended. The prosecutor's mouth fell open. We were never told about this witness. Elena turned to him. He came forward 3 days ago after seeing news coverage of the case. I disclosed his name and statement yesterday afternoon as required. She pulled a printed email from her folder and handed a copy to the clerk. The prosecutor checked his phone, then sank into his chair, defeated. Pierce looked like he'd swallowed something bitter. But the rules were clear. He couldn't block it. Mr. Rivera took the stand, a soft-spoken man in a security uniform, hands folded respectfully. He explained how he'd gone back through the building's footage after hearing about the arrest. I knew it couldn't be him, he said. He's quiet, polite, always says goodnight. And that night he came in carrying laundry, just like always. He played a short clip on a tablet the court provided. There it was, clear as day. Her client, in the same clothes from his night shift, walking into his building at 9:22, calm and alone. The jury watched in silence. One man leaned over and whispered to his neighbor. A woman wiped her eyes. Now it was Elena's turn for closing arguments. She didn't shout. She didn't dramatize. She just walked slowly in front of the jury box and spoke like she was talking to friends over coffee. We don't need perfect evidence to know the truth, she said. We just need honest evidence. And what you've seen today isn't just doubt, it's proof. Proof that my client wasn't there. Proof that the identification was flawed. Proof that this arrest was rushed, careless, and wrong. She looked at each juror one by one. The law doesn't ask you to be certain about guilt. It asks you to be certain beyond a reasonable doubt. And if there's even one doubt, if there's one piece of evidence that doesn't fit, then your duty is clear. She sat down. The room was so quiet you could hear the clock ticking on the wall. The prosecutor's closing felt rushed, defensive. He kept saying, trust the system, but after what the jury had just seen, those words rang hollow. Judge Pierce gave the jury their instructions in a flat, tired voice. No extra comments, no smirks. For the first time, he seemed small. As the jury left to deliberate, Elena packed her briefcase slowly. Her client looked at her, eyes wide with hope and fear. Do you think? I think the jury had only been out for 20 minutes when the bailiff knocked on the judge's chamber's door. That was unusually fast, so fast that a few lawyers in the hallway exchanged nervous glances. Short deliberations usually meant one thing. The decision was obvious. But no one could tell which way it would go. Inside the courtroom, the air felt charged like before a summer storm. The defendant sat stiffly at the defense table, knuckles white around the edge of his chair. Elena placed a hand lightly on his arm, not to comfort but to steady. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. They both knew this moment would change everything. The jury filed back in, faces unreadable. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a no-nonsense bun, stood when asked for the verdict. "We find the defendant not guilty." A soft gasp rippled through the room. The young man beside Elena let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. His shoulders dropped, and for the first time in months his eyes filled with something other than fear. Relief, disbelief, maybe even the first flicker of hope. But Judge Pierce didn't look relieved. He looked cornered. He dismissed the jury with a curt nod, then announced a 10-minute recess before handling post-trial motions. As people began to shuffle out, buzzing with quiet excitement, Elena stayed seated, organizing her files with deliberate calm. She knew this wasn't over. Not for her. Sure enough, as she stepped into the hallway to get some air, the judge's clerk approached. "Judge wants to see you in chambers now." Elena nodded. She'd been expecting this. The judge's private office was exactly what you'd imagine. Dark wood, leather chairs, framed awards lining the walls, and a view of the city skyline that probably cost more than her annual salary. Pierce stood by the window, back turned, hands clasped behind him. "Close the door," he said without looking. She did. He turned slowly, his expression unreadable at first. Then his voice dropped, low and sharp. "You played me." "I followed the law," Eleanor replied evenly. "Don't give me that textbook nonsense," he snapped. "You knew that footage existed. You held it back until the last second just to embarrass me in front of the jury." "I disclosed it the moment I had it verified," she said. "You had the same information the prosecution did. If you didn't read it, that's not my fault." His face flushed. He took a step closer. "You think you're some kind of hero? Standing up for criminals, making judges look foolish? This system works because people like me keep order. And people like you? You just stir up trouble." Elena didn't flinch. She met his gaze, steady and clear. The system only works when it's fair. And when judges use their power to protect the truth, not their egos, that's when real order happens. For a long moment, he just stared at her. Then with a bitter laugh, he said, "You're finished here. I'll make sure no courtroom in this district takes you seriously again." That's when Elena reached into her briefcase. She pulled out a plain manila envelope, sealed with a red stamp from the State Judicial Conduct Commission. She placed it gently on his desk. "I already filed a formal complaint this morning," she said. "It includes sworn statements from 3 court clerks, bank records showing unexplained deposits matching case dismissals, audio from a legally recorded conversation where you pressured a witness to change testimony, and a timeline of rulings that consistently benefited your campaign donors." Pierce's face went pale. "You can't prove any of that." "I don't have to prove it all," she said quietly. "I just have to raise enough concern for an investigation. And given what happened in this courtroom today, plus the reporter from the city desk who's been asking questions downtown, I think they'll take it seriously." He lunged forward, grabbing the envelope. "You think you can destroy me over one case?" "This isn't about one case," Elena said. "It's about every person who walked into your courtroom hoping for justice and got a verdict, based on who you liked or what someone paid you. I've seen the pattern. Others have too, and now? It's on paper." She turned to leave. "Wait," he said, voice suddenly smaller. "What do you want?" "I don't want anything," she replied without turning. "I just want you to stop pretending you're above the law." She walked out and closed the door behind her. Outside, the sun had broken through the clouds. Reporters were starting to gather near the courthouse steps. Word had spread fast about the acquittal and the judge's odd behavior. One of them, the woman from the independent news outlet, caught Elena's eye and gave a small, knowing nod. Elena didn't stop for interviews. She walked with her client to the bus stop, where his mother was waiting, tears streaming down her face. They hugged for a long time, the kind of hug that carries months of fear and prayers. Elena stood a few steps away, giving them space, watching the relief wash over them like rain after a drought. Later that afternoon, back in her office, her phone buzzed. It was an email from the Judicial Commission. Complaint received. Investigation opened. "Thank you for your cooperation." She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. But she did take a deep breath, longer and fuller than she had in weeks. By evening, the local news ran a short segment. "Judge under review following misconduct allegations tied to recent trial." No names were mentioned yet, but everyone in legal circles knew. Court clerks started whispering. Other public defenders sent quiet messages of support. Even a few private attorneys, people who'd once rolled their eyes at her idealism, reached out to say, "You did the right thing." Judge Pierce didn't show up for court the next day. A substitute judge handled his docket. Rumor had it he'd taken personal leave, but Elena wasn't focused on him anymore. She was already reviewing her next case. A single mother facing eviction over a $90 late fee, in a building owned by one of the same developers who donated heavily to Pierce's last campaign. She opened a fresh legal pad, wrote the client's name at the top, and began making notes, because for her this was never about one victory or one corrupt judge. It was about showing up day after day for the people who had no one else. And sometimes the quietest voices are the ones that echo the loudest.